I thought I'd last longer than this. That's what everyone thinks, right? You picture yourself adapting, getting smarter, tougher. But the Wasteland doesn't care what you pictured. It just keeps taking pieces of you, small ones at first, ones you tell yourself don't matter, until you look down one day and realize there's not much left to give. I woke up inside a metal box that smelled like rust and old sweat, and for maybe 30 seconds I didn't remember why. Then the sound came back, distant thunder that wasn't thunder, the low grinding hum I'd been hearing for 3 days straight, before the shelter door finally opened and everything went quiet in a way that made my stomach turn. The door was still open. Light came through in a shaft that looked solid enough to touch, full of dust that moved in patterns I couldn't predict. I sat up, and my back protested in ways that felt new. Vertebrae making sounds they shouldn't make, and I realized I'd been sleeping on bare metal with nothing between me and the floor but my jacket rolled up under my head. My mouth tasted like I'd been chewing on batteries. Someone had told me the all clear would sound. Someone had said there would be a signal, that we'd know when it was safe. But the only sound now was my own breathing and a rhythmic drip somewhere deeper in the shelter. I listened for voices and heard nothing. I called out and my voice came back smaller than I'd sent it, absorbed by concrete and steel and the particular silence that comes when you're the only thing alive in a space built for dozens. I found my boots near the wall where I must have kicked them off. They were still laced. I didn't remember taking them off. When I pulled them on, my feet felt swollen and tender, like I'd walked further than I actually had, like the bones inside had expanded during the night. I tied them slowly because my fingers weren't working right, because some part of me knew that once I stood up and walked toward that open door, I'd be making a choice I couldn't unmake. The shelter had been a maintenance station before the bombs. I knew that because someone had spray-painted it on the wall in letters 3 feet high, Metro Maintenance Personnel Only. Below that, someone else had written in smaller, neater script, not anymore. The floor was covered in empty tin cans and wrappers that crinkled when I stepped on them, evidence of however many people had sheltered here and then left without waking me. I tried to remember if I'd actually seen anyone else or if I'd just assumed I wasn't alone based on the trash, based on the sound of breathing that might have been my own echoing off the walls. There was a drinking fountain near the entrance. I tried it without expecting anything and got nothing, just a cough of air and a smell like old pipes. My tongue sat thick and dry in my mouth. I'd drunk the last of my water sometime yesterday or the day before. Time had gotten elastic down here, and I'd been telling myself I'd ration better once I found more. That was before I understood that everything in the world now was about what you'd already used up. I walked toward the light because there was nothing else to do, because staying in the shelter meant dying slowly in the dark, and I wasn't ready for that yet. The opening was narrow, just wide enough for the door to swing in, and beyond it I could see a slice of outside that looked wrong in ways my brain kept trying to correct. The sky was there, but it had the color of old bruises, purple-gray shot through with yellows that didn't belong. The light itself felt thin, like it was traveling through something thicker than air. When I stepped outside, the smell hit me first. Chemical and organic at once, burning plastic mixed with something sweet and rotten underneath, and beneath that a metal taste that coated the inside of my nose and throat. I'd expected smoke, but there wasn't any, just this haze that sat over everything, turning the ruins of the city into suggestions of buildings, shapes that might have been familiar if I could see them clearly. The street was still there. That surprised me more than it should have. I'd pictured total destruction, craters and rubble, but the asphalt remained mostly intact, buckled in places and covered with a fine gray powder that puffed up around my boots when I walked. Cars sat where they'd stopped, some burned down to their frames and some barely touched, and I could see bodies in a few of them. Slumped shapes I didn't look at directly because looking felt like acknowledging something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. I'd prepared for this. I'd thought about it, read about it, convinced myself I understood what nuclear war meant. I had a pack with supplies, 3 days of food, a water filter, a first aid kit, a knife, a flashlight with extra batteries. I had a plan that involved finding water, finding shelter, finding other survivors. The plan was still in my head, each step clear and logical, and I started walking because walking was step one and I didn't know what else to do. The heat came up through the soles of my boots. The ground radiated warmth like it was still cooking, like the explosion had baked something into the earth that would take years to cool. Within 10 minutes I was sweating despite the air feeling cool against my face. Within 20 minutes my shirt was stuck to my back and I was breathing harder than the walking should have required. There was a grocery store 3 blocks from the shelter entrance. I knew because I'd mapped the area in my head during the days before, when mapping things seemed like useful preparation. The building was still standing, but the windows were gone, just empty frames filled with that yellowish haze. I approached slowly because the plan said to be careful, to watch for structural damage, to avoid anywhere that looked unstable. Inside was darker than outside and my eyes took time to adjust. When they did, I saw that the shelves were mostly empty, stripped clean in what must have been the first hours before the bombs fell. What remained was scattered across the floor, broken jars, crushed boxes, produce rotted down to black shapes that merged with the shadows. The smell was overwhelming, thick enough that I could feel it in my lungs, and I pulled my shirt up over my nose and mouth, even though it didn't help much. I found a bottle of water wedged behind a shelf in the back, overlooked or dropped by whoever had been here before. The plastic was warm and slightly soft, like it had been melting. I held it up to the light coming through the empty windows, and the liquid inside looked clear, looked normal, and I knew I should test it with the filter, or at least wait, but my throat was so dry it clicked when I swallowed, and I twisted the cap off and drank half of it in 4 long pulls that hurt going down. It tasted like plastic and something else, something metallic that made my teeth ache, but it was wet, and that was what mattered. I told myself the radiation probably wasn't that bad this far from the blast sites, that the bottle had been sealed, that I'd be fine. I saved the other half and put it in my pack and continued searching, even though I knew I wouldn't find anything useful. What I found instead was a man sitting in the manager's office, or what was left of a man, slumped in a desk chair with his hands folded in his lap like he'd decided to rest for just a minute. His skin had gone the color of wax, and his eyes were open and clouded. I left before I could notice any more details. Outside, the sky had darkened even though it couldn't have been more than mid-morning. The yellow in the clouds had spread, giving everything a jaundiced tint, and the haze was thicker now, close enough that I could see it moving in slow currents like something alive. My eyes started watering, and I rubbed them without thinking, and that made it worse, made them burn and stream, until I had to stop walking and just stand there blinking tears that didn't help. I needed clean water. That was the priority. The plan said to find a stream or a well, somewhere with flowing water that wouldn't be contaminated. I tried to remember the nearest creek and realized I had no idea if it would even still be there, if the landscape I'd known still existed under the ash and dust. I picked a direction that felt right and started walking, and within an hour I was lost in a city I'd lived in for 6 years. The streets didn't make sense anymore. Intersections I thought I recognized opened onto rubble fields or collapsed buildings that blocked the way forward. Street signs were down or melted or simply gone. I navigated by the sun, except I couldn't see the sun, just a bright spot in the sky that drifted behind the clouds and gave me nothing useful. I walked in what I hoped was a straight line, and after an hour realized I'd somehow circled back to pass the same burned-out bus twice. The exhaustion came faster than it should have. My legs felt heavy and my breathing got shallow, and I had to stop every few blocks to rest against whatever was still standing. The heat from the ground kept rising, and the air kept tasting worse, and I started to understand that this wasn't normal exertion, that something in the environment was working on me in ways I couldn't see. I found a park, or what had been a park. The trees were black spikes sticking up from scorched earth, and the playground equipment had melted into abstract sculptures of twisted metal. There was a fountain in the center, dry except for a puddle of something dark and thick at the bottom. I didn't get close enough to see what it was. A dog wandered across the open space while I watched, moving slowly, and when it got closer, I saw that patches of its fur had fallen out and the skin underneath was raw and weeping. It didn't seem to notice me. It just kept walking in a straight line until it reached the edge of the park and disappeared behind the remains of a fence. I wondered how long it had been wandering. I wondered if it was looking for its owner. By afternoon, my head had started to hurt in a way that felt deep and persistent, not like a normal headache but like pressure building behind my eyes. My hands were shaking when I pulled out my last energy bar and tried to eat it. The food tasted like cardboard and my stomach lurched when I swallowed. I ate it anyway because the plan said to maintain caloric intake, to keep my strength up, and I still believed the plan mattered. I found water in a runoff drain behind what might have been an office building. It pooled in a concrete depression, murky and brown but liquid. I set up my filter with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, pumping the water through into my bottle, watching it come out slightly less brown on the other side. The filter wasn't designed for this. It was meant for camping trips, for clearing out bacteria and sediment from mountain streams, not for whatever cocktail of chemicals and fallout was dissolved in this runoff. But I needed water, and this was water, and I drank it and tried not to think about what I might be putting into my body. The shaking got worse after that. I told myself it was just exhaustion, just the stress of the day. But my hands wouldn't steady, and my legs felt weak, and when I started walking again, I stumbled over nothing, over flat ground, and barely caught myself. The world tilted slightly, like I was walking on the deck of a ship, and I had to stop and close my eyes and breathe slowly until the sensation passed. I needed shelter before dark. That was the next step. The plan said to find somewhere defensible, somewhere I could secure and rest. I started looking at buildings differently, evaluating them for structural integrity, for access points, for how many ways someone or something could get inside. Most were too damaged or too exposed. The ones that looked intact also looked occupied, or like they had been, doors hanging open and trash scattered, and signs of habitation I didn't want to investigate. I found a pharmacy with its security gate partially pulled down, just enough gap at the bottom to crawl through. Inside was dark and cool and smelled like chemicals and rot. I used my flashlight sparingly, sweeping the beam across overturned shelves and scattered pills that crunched under my boots. The pharmacy counter was in the back, and I climbed over it and found a small office with a door that's still locked. The space was barely big enough to lie down in. There was a desk and a chair and filing cabinets, and I pushed the chair against the door, even though the lock still worked because two barriers felt better than one. Then I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and finally let myself stop moving. My whole body hurt, not in specific places but everywhere, like my cells were individually aching. The headache had gotten worse and my vision did strange things when I moved my eyes too fast, trails and after images that took seconds to fade. I drank more of the filtered water and it didn't help. I tried to eat another bar and managed 3 bites before my stomach rebelled and I had to stop. The trembling wouldn't quit. I held my hands up in the flashlight beam and watched them shake, fine, rapid movements I couldn't control. I told myself it was just adrenaline, just shock, just normal reactions to an abnormal situation. I told myself I'd feel better after sleep. I told myself a lot of things while I sat there in the dark and listened to sounds outside that I couldn't identify. Something fell in the pharmacy with a crash that made me flinch so hard I hit my head on the wall. I killed the flashlight and sat in pure darkness, listening. Footsteps, maybe. Or something being dragged. Or just debris settling. I couldn't tell. The sound came again, closer, and then receded. I waited until silence returned, and then waited longer, and eventually I turned the light back on, just to make sure I was still alone. Sleep came in fragments. I'd drop under for what felt like minutes and wake up gasping, my heart hammering, unable to remember what I'd been dreaming but carrying the emotion of it into waking. The fear didn't fade when I opened my eyes. It sat in my chest, heavy and constant. And I started to understand that this was going to be my baseline now, that this level of fear was just how existence felt now. Sometime in the night I vomited. The water came up sour and burning, and I threw up until there was nothing left, and then dry heaved until my ribs ached. I wiped my mouth on my sleeve and tried not to think about radiation sickness, about how the symptoms started, about how long I might have. I told myself it was just bad water, just stress, just my body adjusting. When grey light started seeping under the door, I realized I'd survived the first night. The thought didn't bring relief. It just meant I had to do it again, had to survive another day, and another after that, and the prospect felt impossible in a way I hadn't anticipated. This wasn't like camping. This wasn't an adventure. This was just grinding endurance with no endpoint in sight. I crawled out from behind the pharmacy counter, and the morning light showed me what I'd missed in the dark. There were bodies in the aisles. 3 of them, sprawled where they'd fallen, one still clutching a bottle of pills. I'd walked past them the night before without seeing them. I stepped over them now without looking too closely and pushed myself back out through the gap in the security gate. The sky was the same sick yellow, and the haze hadn't lifted. My eyes had stopped watering, but they felt gritty and sore, like I'd been rubbing sand into them. Everything looked slightly off. Colors shifted, edges blurred. I blinked hard, and it didn't help. I started to wonder if this was permanent, if whatever was in the air was doing something to my vision that wouldn't heal. I needed food. The energy bars were gone, and my stomach was empty, and even though the thought of eating made me feel sick, I knew I had to find something. I walked without a clear destination, just moving, checking buildings at random. A convenience store with every shelf stripped. A restaurant where the booths still held the desiccated remains of final meals. A house with the door standing open and mail scattered across the porch, envelopes addressed to people who weren't coming back. I found canned goods in a basement 2 blocks over, rows of them on metal shelving, and the relief hit me so hard I almost cried. I grabbed what I could carry, beans, soup, vegetables in brine, and shoved them into my pack until the weight made my shoulders ache. There was a can opener on the shelf, and I took that too. And for maybe 10 minutes I felt like I'd won something, like I'd beaten the odds. The feeling didn't last. By the time I climbed back out of the basement, I was shaking again, and my head was pounding, and the pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds. I made it 3 blocks before I had to stop and rest, sitting on the curb with my head between my knees, breathing hard and trying not to pass out. Someone had been here recently. I could see footprints in the ash, boot treads that were fresher than mine, and the sight made my pulse spike. I looked around but saw no one. The street was empty except for me and the ruins and that persistent haze that made everything look like it was dissolving at the edges. I started paying attention to signs of other survivors. Makeshift camps in alleys, clothes drying on lines strung between buildings, fires that were still warm when I passed. I never saw the people themselves, but I knew they were there, moving through the same wreckage, searching for the same resources. The thought of encountering them terrified me more than being alone did. On the 3rd day, I found a body that was fresh. A woman, maybe 30, lying in the middle of an intersection with her arms spread and her eyes open to the yellow sky. No visible wounds, no blood. She just looked like she'd laid down and stopped. Her pack was still on her back, and I knew I should search it, that she didn't need the supplies anymore, but I couldn't make myself touch her. I walked around and kept going and tried not to think about how I'd looked away from her face as quickly as I could. The hunger was constant now, but eating was getting harder. I'd open a can of beans and manage a few bites before my stomach turned. The smell alone was often enough to trigger nausea. I forced myself to eat anyway, chewing mechanically, swallowing without tasting, because the alternative was starving, and I wasn't ready for that yet. But the food didn't seem to help. I stayed tired and weak, and the trembling never fully stopped. I tried to establish a routine. Wake up, drink water, eat something, walk, search for supplies, find shelter before dark. The routine was supposed to give structure, to make the days manageable, but each step took more effort than it should have, and I kept losing time, finding myself somewhere with no memory of how I'd gotten there, hours gone without explanation. The nights were the worst. I'd find a space that felt secure and lock myself in, and then spend hours listening to the sounds of the city settling, metal creaking and glass falling, and things moving in the dark that I couldn't identify. Sometimes I heard voices, distant and distorted, and I never knew if they were real or if my mind was inventing them. I'd lie awake and count my breaths and wait for morning. On the fourth day, I cut my hand opening a can. The edge sliced clean across my palm, deep enough that blood welled up immediately and wouldn't stop. I wrapped it in a piece of cloth torn from my shirt and kept pressure on it, but the bleeding continued, soaking through the makeshift bandage, dripping onto the ground. I went through the first aid kit looking for gauze and found that the packets had somehow gotten wet, the contents ruined and stuck together. I used them anyway, wrapping layer after layer around my hand until the blood finally slowed. The cut throbbed for hours. I could feel my pulse in it, each beat sending a spike of pain up my arm. I tried to keep the hand elevated and keep moving and keep searching for supplies, but the injury made everything harder. I couldn't grip properly. I couldn't use the hand for leverage. Simple tasks became complicated and frustrating, and I found myself near tears over things like opening bottles or tying knots. That night, the hand started to swell. The skin around the cut went tight and hot, and when I unwrapped the bandage, the wound looked worse than it should have, edges red and puffy. I cleaned it with some of my precious clean water and rewrapped it and tried not to think about infection, about what happened to infected wounds in a world without antibiotics or hospitals. By morning, my hand was twice its normal size and I couldn't make a fist. The pain had spread to my wrist and forearm and I could see red streaks starting to creep up toward my elbow. I knew what that meant. I'd read about infections, about blood poisoning, about how fast things could go wrong. I needed medicine, but I'd already been through every pharmacy I'd passed and found nothing but empty shelves and broken glass. I spent the day searching with increasing desperation, breaking into houses and offices and anywhere that might have a first aid kit or forgotten pills. I found expired aspirin and swallowed 4 of them. I found a tube of antibiotic ointment squeezed mostly empty and used what was left. I found a bottle of vodka in a kitchen cabinet and poured it over the wound, even though the pain made me scream. Nothing helped. The swelling got worse and the red streaks climbed higher, and by evening I was running a fever, hot and cold at the same time, shivering while sweat ran down my face. I found a building with an intact roof and barricaded myself inside and lay on the floor trying to breathe through the pain. The fever brought dreams that felt realer than waking. I was back in the shelter, listening to the bombs fall. I was in the grocery store watching the dead man breathe. I was walking through streets that kept changing, buildings rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking, and every path I took led back to the same intersection where the woman lay with her arms spread and her eyes reflecting that yellow sky. I woke up sometime in the night, convinced someone was in the room with me. I could hear breathing that wasn't mine, and footsteps and the creak of floorboards. I lay perfectly still with my eyes open but couldn't see anything in the darkness. The sounds continued, circling me, getting closer. I fumbled for my flashlight, and when I got it on, the room was empty except for me and my fear. The fever broke on the 6th day, and I woke up weak and soaked with sweat but clearer than I'd been. My hand was still swollen and painful, but the streaks had stopped advancing and some of the heat had gone out of the wound. I changed the bandage with the last of the gauze and took 2 more aspirin and forced myself to eat half a can of soup that tasted like metal. I'd survived the infection. That should have felt like a victory, but it just felt like luck, like I'd gotten away with something I shouldn't have attempted. The cut was still there and still dirty, and I knew the odds of it healing properly in these conditions were low. I knew that next time I might not be so lucky. I started to understand that survival in the Wasteland wasn't about skill or preparation. It was about how long you could stay ahead of the things that were trying to kill you. That day I saw my first other survivor, a man walking on the opposite side of a wide boulevard, moving with purpose like he knew where he was going. He was too far away for me to see details, but I could tell he was armed, something long slung across his back. I froze and watched him pass, and he never looked in my direction. When he was gone, I realized I was relieved. I'd wanted to see other people, had been looking for them, but now that I had, I felt nothing but dread at the prospect of interaction. The next person I saw was closer, a woman digging through trash in an alley, her movements quick and furtive. She looked up when I approached, and our eyes met, and for a second, neither of us moved. Then she grabbed what she'd been searching for and ran, disappearing around a corner before I could say anything. I stood there, feeling like I'd failed some kind of test. I started to notice the camps more clearly now. Shelters made from corrugated metal and tarps, cooking fires with fresh ash, hanging laundry. Signs of communities forming in the ruins, people clustering together. I avoided them all. Something about the way they'd been arranged, the barriers and the sightlines, made it clear they weren't welcoming strangers. On the 7th day, I ran out of clean water. The filter was clogged with sediment and no amount of backflushing would clear it. I tried to use it anyway, and what came out the other side was barely clearer than what went in. I drank it because I had no choice and spent the afternoon vomiting behind an abandoned gas station, my body rejecting the contaminated water even as I knew I'd have to drink more. The ash was in everything now. It coated my clothes and my hair and the inside of my pack. It got in my food when I ate and between my teeth when I closed my mouth. I could feel it in my lungs when I breathed, a fine grit that made me cough and never fully came out. My nose bled sometimes for no reason, and when I wiped it, the blood came away grey. I tried to keep track of the days but lost count somewhere around the end of the first week. Time had stopped making sense. I'd think I'd been walking for an hour and find that it had been 3. I'd lie down to rest and wake up with the sun in a different position and no idea how long I'd been unconscious. The exhaustion was cumulative, building each day, never fully lifting, even after sleep. My body was changing in ways I tried not to notice. My clothes hung looser. My face in broken mirrors looked gaunt and hollow. My hair was falling out in clumps, and I could see ribs under my skin when I lifted my shirt. The cut on my hand had scabbed over but wouldn't heal properly, the edges staying inflamed and tender. New sores appeared where my pack rubbed against my shoulders, raw patches that wept and stuck to my shirt. The plan had fallen apart completely. I'd given up on finding flowing water or defensible shelter or other survivors who might help. Now I just moved from one day to the next, scavenging what I could find, sleeping where I felt marginally safe, trying to stay alive without any clear idea of why it mattered. I found a library still partially standing and spent a day inside just to be out of the haze. The books were there, but most had been damaged by fire or water, pages stuck together or crumbled to dust. I found one that was mostly intact, a novel about a family on a road trip, and I tried to read it, but the words wouldn't connect. I'd get through a paragraph and have no idea what it had said. My brain felt slow and thick, processing everything a beat behind real time. That night, I slept on the library floor and dreamed about clean water and hot food and the apartment I used to live in. The apartment had working lights and heat and a shower that ran clear. In the dream, I stood under the water for hours, washing away layers of ash and grime, and when I woke up I was crying and couldn't make myself stop. The settlements were getting larger. I could see them spreading, people organizing, building walls from rubble and scrap metal. I watched from a distance as groups moved in coordinated patterns, gathering supplies, posting guards, establishing territory. They looked purposeful in a way I no longer felt. I tried to imagine approaching one, asking to join, but I couldn't picture it working. I had nothing to offer. I was just another mouth to feed, another body taking up space. I started taking more risks. I'd climb into buildings that looked unstable. I'd drink from puddles without filtering. I'd walk through areas that felt wrong, where the radiation made my skin tingle and my teeth ache. Some part of me had stopped caring about safety, had decided that quick death might be preferable to slow erosion. Nothing killed me. I climbed and drank and walked and kept going, and each day I woke up, still alive, felt like a punishment. On what might have been the 10th day, I found a store that hadn't been completely looted. The front was blocked by rubble, but I found a way in through the back, crawling through a gap barely wide enough for my shoulders. Inside was darker than anywhere I'd been, and I used the flashlight even though the batteries were dying, the beam getting yellower and weaker each time I turned it on. The store had been a sporting goods place. There were still camping supplies scattered across the floor, tents and sleeping bags and cooking equipment. I found a water bottle that was actually designed for backcountry use, with a built-in filter better than the one I'd been using. I found a sleeping bag that was only slightly moldy. I found boots that were close to my size and in better shape than the ones I had on. I sat on the floor surrounded by this treasure and felt nothing. I should have been elated, but all I could think about was how it didn't matter. How I'd just wear these things out like I'd worn out everything else. How they were temporary solutions to permanent problems. I took what I could carry and left the rest. Outside, the sky was darker than usual, clouds thick and low, and within an hour it started to rain. Not clean rain, but something heavy and oily that left streaks on my skin and tasted chemical when it hit my lips. I found shelter in a parking garage and watched the rain fall in curtains across the entrance, listened to it hiss and pop on the pavement. The rain brought people out. I could see them moving between buildings, collecting the water in whatever containers they had. I understood why water was water, but I couldn't make myself join them. I stayed in the garage and drank from my bottle and watched them risk exposure for something I knew was probably poisonous. When the rain stopped, everything smelled worse. The chemical smell intensified, mixing with the rot and the ash, and I wrapped cloth around my face just to filter it slightly. My eyes were watering again and my throat felt raw, and I started coughing and couldn't stop, deep racking coughs that left me dizzy and tasting blood. I found a clinic that had been a veterinary office before the war. Most of the supplies were designed for animals, but I searched anyway, desperate for anything. I found antibiotics in a locked cabinet, pills meant for dogs but still sealed and labeled. I took them, even though I didn't know the dosage, even though using animal medicine on myself was probably dangerous. I was past caring about probably dangerous. The pills helped. Within a day, the infection in my hand started to recede, and the cough got less severe, and I felt marginally more functional. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, and I cried again, sitting on the floor of an empty examination room, crying over antibiotics like they were precious jewels. I rationed them carefully after that, one every other day, saving them, trying to make them last. I'd found a thing that worked, and I was terrified of running out, terrified of being back where I'd been before. The settlements were fighting now. I could hear gunfire sometimes, echoing through the ruins, and see smoke rising from different sections of the city. I didn't know what they were fighting over: territory, supplies, old grievances, but the sound made me change my route, made me avoid areas where the shooting seemed concentrated. I saw a body hanging from a light post, strung up as a warning or a message. I didn't stop to read the sign pinned to the chest. I kept walking and tried to forget the way it turned slowly in the wind. The isolation was becoming total. Days would pass without seeing another person. I'd hear them sometimes, voices carrying through empty streets, but I never tried to make contact. I'd become something feral, something that moved through the ruins like a ghost, interacting with the environment but not participating in whatever society was forming. My possessions were wearing out. The boots I'd found developed holes, and the sleeping bag lost its insulation, and the flashlight finally died no matter how many times I tried new batteries. I adapted, going barefoot when necessary, sleeping cold, navigating by feel in the dark. Each loss diminished me, but I kept functioning, kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and I wasn't ready yet, even though I couldn't articulate why. The dreams got worse. Every night brought variations on the same themes: being trapped, being chased, watching the bombs fall on an endless loop. I'd wake up screaming sometimes and have to remind myself where I was, that the war was over, that the bombs were done falling. The reminder didn't help much. The new world was just as terrifying as the old one ending. I found a photo album in a house, pictures of a family doing normal things, birthday parties and graduations and Christmas mornings. I looked at their faces and tried to remember what normal felt like and couldn't. That life might as well have been fiction. It had no connection to the person I was now, the creature living in ruins and eating spoiled food and drinking poison water. On what I thought might be the 14th day, I fell, just tripped over debris I should have seen and went down hard, catching myself wrong, and felt something in my ankle pop. The pain was instant and sharp, and I knew immediately it was bad. I tried to stand and my leg wouldn't support weight. I tried again and nearly blacked out. I dragged myself into a nearby building and examined the ankle as well as I could. It was already swelling and turning purple, and when I touched it gently, the pain made me gasp. Sprained at minimum, possibly broken. I had nothing to splint it with, and no way to get proper medical attention, and I was 3 miles from the closest shelter I knew was secure. I sat there and tried to think logically about my options. I could stay here and hope the ankle healed enough to walk on. I could try to crawl or drag myself back to somewhere safer. I could wait for someone to pass and try to get help. Each option seemed worse than the others. Each required more strength than I had. I wrapped the ankle as tightly as I could with strips of cloth and found a piece of pipe to use as a crutch. Standing was agony. The first step made me sob. The second nearly made me fall again. I persisted anyway because staying here meant dying, and dying felt different when it was immediate instead of gradual. It took 6 hours to cover 3 miles. 6 hours of hobbling and resting and trying not to scream, of focusing entirely on the next step and nothing beyond that. By the time I reached the building I'd been aiming for, the sky was getting dark, and I was shaking so badly I could barely grip the makeshift crutch. I collapsed on the floor just inside the door and didn't move for what might have been hours. The pain was overwhelming, a throbbing fire that consumed my entire leg and radiated up into my hip. I tried to elevate it, and that helped marginally. I took one of my precious antibiotic pills and hoped it would do something for the swelling. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by pain. I'd drift under and shift position, and the ankle would remind me it was destroyed, and I'd wake up gasping. Morning came eventually, and I was still alive, and that felt like a cruel joke. The ankle didn't get better. Days passed and it stayed swollen and tender, and I couldn't put my full weight on it. I could barely walk, could barely search for supplies, could barely function. My world shrank to the single building I was trapped in, to the rooms I could reach by crawling or dragging myself. I ran through my food in 3 days. The water lasted 4. After that I was back to nothing, injured and immobile and slowly starving. I tried to ration my strength, to move only when absolutely necessary, but necessity came often. I needed water, I needed food, I needed to stay alive even though I couldn't remember why anymore. I crawled to a nearby building and found canned vegetables that had swollen with botulism and a dead rat in a corner and nothing else. I crawled to another and found cleaning supplies and paper products, and no food at all. The effort of crawling left me exhausted and sweating, and the ankle throbbed with each movement, but I kept going because the alternative was worse. On what might have been day 17, I heard voices outside, multiple people, talking low, footsteps on pavement. I froze where I was and listened. They were searching the buildings. I could hear doors opening and closing, could hear them getting closer. I dragged myself behind a counter and tried to make myself small and invisible. They entered the building and I heard them moving through the front rooms, 2 men from the sound of it, maybe 3. They were looking for supplies, talking about what they'd found in other places, arguing about whether to keep moving or set up camp. Their voices got closer and I pressed myself against the wall and stopped breathing. One of them came into the room I was hiding in. I could see his boots through a gap in the counter, could hear him shifting things around. He was thorough, checking corners and cabinets, and I knew he'd find me eventually. My hand moved toward the knife in my belt, even though I had no illusions about being able to fight. He saw me. I watched his boots stop moving, and then he was looking over the counter, and we made eye contact. He was young, maybe 20, with a face that was too thin and eyes that had seen too much. We stared at each other for a long moment, and I waited for him to call out to the others. He didn't. He looked at me, looked at my wrapped ankle and my gaunt face and the knife I was holding without even realizing it, and something crossed his expression. Not pity exactly, but recognition. Like he saw himself in me, or saw his future. Then he turned away and called to the others that the room was clear, and they all left. I stayed behind the counter for an hour after they were gone, shaking and unable to process what had happened. He'd let me go, or he'd dismissed me as not worth the trouble. Or he'd simply decided I was already dead enough that it didn't matter. I didn't know which, and I wasn't sure the distinction mattered. The encounter changed something in me. I'd been avoiding people out of fear, but now I understood that the fear went both ways. I looked like what I was, something broken and used up, something barely hanging on. I wasn't a threat. I was just another casualty waiting to finish dying. The ankle started to heal eventually. The swelling went down and I could put weight on it without screaming, and after 2 weeks I could walk without the crutch if I was careful. The improvement felt miraculous, even though I knew it was just standard healing, the body doing what bodies do when given time. I started moving again, expanding my territory, searching for supplies with renewed urgency. I found less than before. The city was being picked clean. Every building had been searched multiple times. Every cache had been found and emptied. The easy survival was over. Now it was about finding the things other people had missed, about taking risks they wouldn't take. I climbed into buildings other people avoided. I dug through piles of rubble. I went into basements flooded with contaminated water and attics that reeked of decay. I found enough to keep going and nothing more. Survival became its own full-time occupation. Every waking hour spent in search of the bare minimum to continue existing. The weather was changing. The sky stayed that sick yellow, but the temperature was dropping, cold creeping in at night and lingering into the morning. I still had the sleeping bag, but it wasn't enough. I started sleeping in layers of clothing, started looking for better shelter, started dreading the coming winter. I met another survivor on day 23. Not met exactly, but passed on the street, close enough to speak if we'd wanted to. She was older than me, moving slowly, carrying a pack that looked too heavy. We made eye contact and nodded and kept walking. The interaction lasted 5 seconds and felt like a conversation. We were alive. We were still trying. That was all that needed to be said. I started seeing more people as I ventured further from my usual routes. Never crowds, just individuals or small groups, all of them looking like I felt worn down and weary and focused entirely on the next meal. We avoided each other by unspoken agreement, giving space, not competing directly. The city was big enough that we could all carve out territories without overlap. I found a working water pump in the basement of an apartment complex. The water came up brown and bitter, but it came up, and that was what mattered. I set up a camp nearby, a room on the 3rd floor with a door that locked and a window I could escape through if necessary. It wasn't safe, but nothing was safe. It was just less dangerous than other options. The routine re-established itself around this new base. Wake up, pump water, eat if I had food, search the surrounding blocks, return before dark. The days blurred together again, undifferentiated except by what I found or didn't find, by whether I went to sleep hungry or merely unsatisfied. My body had adjusted to the new normal. The constant low-level nausea was just background noise now. The trembling had become steady enough that I barely noticed it. The aches and pains were so persistent that I only registered them when they got worse. I was adapting, becoming something designed for this environment, and the transformation felt less like evolution and more like degradation. The cuts and scrapes accumulated faster than they healed. I was covered in scabs and bruises and places where the skin had worn through from repeated friction. My hands were calloused and cracked. My feet were raw from wearing boots that didn't fit. I looked at myself in broken mirrors and saw a stranger, someone I wouldn't have recognized a month ago. I started to understand that survival wasn't about staying the same until rescue came. There was no rescue coming. Survival was about becoming something that could live in the ruins, something less than human or maybe more, something stripped down to the essential functions of eating and sleeping and continuing. The settlements were consolidating. The small camps were being absorbed into larger communities or disappearing entirely. I watched the process from a distance, saw walls going up and trade routes forming and the emergence of something that might eventually be called society. I remained outside of it, unable or unwilling to integrate, surviving alone because that was what I knew how to do now. Winter was definitely coming. I could see it in the shorter days and the frost that appeared on metal surfaces in the morning. I started preparing without really knowing how to prepare, gathering materials for fires, looking for warmer clothes, trying to find shelter that would hold heat. The preparations felt inadequate, but I did them anyway because doing something was better than waiting to freeze. On day 30, I went back to the shelter where everything had started. The door was still open, and the inside was still empty except for trash and the ghost of people who'd been there. I stood in the entrance and tried to remember who I'd been when I first emerged, tried to connect that person to who I was now. The gap felt insurmountable. I'd thought I was prepared. I'd thought I understood what survival meant. I'd been so completely wrong that it would have been funny if it wasn't so brutal. Survival wasn't about skills or supplies or planning. It was about how much of yourself you were willing to lose, how much you could compromise and adapt and degrade before you stopped being recognizably human. I'd lost most of myself already. The person who'd worried about being polite, who'd had hobbies and preferences and plans for the future, that person was gone. What remained was something focused entirely on immediate needs, something that thought in terms of food and water and shelter and nothing beyond the next day. I sat in the shelter and ate a can of beans and watched the yellow light fade outside and tried to feel something about the passage of time. 30 days. A month. It felt both impossibly long and like no time at all. I couldn't imagine doing this for another month, for a year, for however long it took for things to stabilize or for me to finally break. But I would do it. I knew that with absolute certainty, I would wake up tomorrow and pump water and search for food and find shelter and go to sleep and wake up and do it again. Not because I wanted to, not because I had hope for the future, but because the alternative was giving up and I wasn't capable of that yet. The Wasteland had taught me that survival was erosion. Every day stripped away something I'd thought was essential. Every choice meant losing something I'd wanted to keep. The process was relentless and irreversible, and there was no endpoint where I'd be done changing, done losing, done becoming something less. I thought about the woman I'd seen in the intersection, lying on her back with her arms spread. I understood her better now. I understood the calculus that led to lying down and letting go, the simple exhaustion that made continuation seem harder than stopping. I wasn't there yet, but I could see the path, could feel myself moving along it with each passing day. The sky was fully dark when I finally left the shelter and walked back to my current territory. The streets were empty and the haze had thickened into something close to fog. My footsteps echoed off dead buildings and came back to me distorted. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a scream, brief and sharp, cut off suddenly. I didn't investigate. I reached my building and climbed the stairs and locked myself into my room and lay down in the sleeping bag. My body hurt in a dozen places. My stomach was empty enough to ache. My mind was fogged and slow, and I couldn't think clearly about anything beyond survival. This was what I'd become. This was what the Wasteland made of people. I closed my eyes and listened to the sounds of the dying city and tried to sleep. Tomorrow, I'd wake up and do it all again, and the day after that, and the day after that, until eventually I'd be the one lying in an intersection with my arms spread, until the erosion was complete. But not tonight. Tonight I was still here, still breathing, still surviving despite everything. That had to count for something even if I couldn't articulate what. The Wasteland demanded everything and gave nothing back but the opportunity to continue, and somehow that was enough to keep going. Somehow,